Still here. I promise this will be time well spent. And so let's give a warm welcome to Ms. Jess Bill.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here, and I'm very thankful to have the opportunity to speak to you today. I work at the University of British Columbia, which is in Vancouver. And today I'm going to speak to you about basically about lesson planning. I'm going to give a framework for looking at how to make what is an effective lesson. How do we measure if a lesson is effective? We'll look at outcomes or objectives, how we deliver a lesson, and the tasks and materials that we use. The framework will be short, and then we're going to focus a bit on some practical ideas of how you can use materials in your classroom and maximize their use for student learning. So we'll look at some examples of practical things you can do in the classroom. And I hope to also share with you a couple of online resources, some websites and materials that I think might be useful for you to use in your classes. I've given this presentation to Lori, and she said, because the website's here, you won't have enough time to write them all down. And she's going to put it on the site for the university, and you can get it from there after. Or if you have a USB, I'm happy to, you can download it from here at the end, because the references are on the slides. One great thing about my job is I get to visit a lot of classes, and I observe a lot of teachers who we hire new teachers, and have the opportunity to give a lot of feedback to teachers on how their lessons went. And usually I find there are three main things that we talk about when we talk about if a lesson was successful or not. And those are really the outcomes. Did the lesson meet the outcomes? Was it a sound delivery? And were the materials and tasks engaging for students? This morning, one of the speakers mentioned something interesting. He spoke about classroom management, and that actually is a challenging part for many teachers. And for me, I would say classroom management comes under the delivery area, and for sure it's something that we have to think about when we're delivering a lesson. I also speak with a lot of students. I work with young adults, and young adults can be vocal about their classes. And often they'll come, and if they have concerns about their classes, I find they're very similar, and they fall into these categories. Often their concerns are about the delivery of a lesson, or the materials the teacher is using, or they're not quite sure about what the outcomes are. So from teacher and student perspective, it's a similar viewpoint. Just to kind of summarize, I think if we look at, if we have clear outcomes, very clear linguistic outcomes, and we have a sound delivery, a delivery that is well thought out, well planned, and we add engaging materials, engaging tasks, I think that we could probably agree that this is a pedagogically effective lesson. Now, of course, if something is missing, then our lesson can fall apart. No matter how well we plan it, if our objectives aren't clear, I think we can have problems. If the materials aren't engaging, our students may not be paying attention, which is sometimes the case. Or, if there's a problem with the delivery, again, we can lose our students. And I think in these situations, we lose the opportunity to maximize learning. So it's a tough job being a teacher. I think a very tough job being a teacher. We have to think about so many things. Every lesson we plan, there are so many things that we have to think about. And I think that teachers are undervalued for what we do. We do a really important job, and it's not an easy job. It's a very difficult job, I think. I think when we evaluate our lessons, or when somebody else comes in and observes to evaluate their lessons, usually these are the kinds of questions that we ask. We ask ourselves, or observers in our class, in teacher training, or if somebody's observing or evaluating your class. Often these are the kinds of questions that the evaluator will ask. Of course, what were the objectives? Were they met? Okay, and I like the second point, and this is what maximize learning? Are we taking advantage of every learning opportunity in the class? And this is difficult to do, especially when you have a large class. It's not always easy to maximize the learning opportunity. Materials we talked about. Again, how do the materials support the objectives? How are they all connected? And I think were the students engaged? To me, this is a really important question because it's really what we're doing. We need to keep our students engaged if we are able to, if we want to reach a certain outcome. Because if they're not engaged and they're not paying attention, it's difficult to achieve the outcomes that we set for each lesson. And that's, again, not an easy thing to do. So I like this little graphic. I'll give you a second to look at it. Have you ever felt like this? Or do you feel sometimes? Sometimes I observe a class and I speak with a teacher after, and the teacher says, "Oh, that was a fantastic lesson." And I think, it's difficult to evaluate how we do because we're looking at it from our viewpoint and we delivered what we prepared. We feel, sometimes, yes, it was successful. And it's difficult to put ourselves in the position of a student sometimes. It's a different perspective. But I think sometimes this happens in teaching, where we're not quite sure if we communicated and how successful our students were in learning what we thought that they were going to learn. I'm just going to have a quick look at the 3 points that we talked about that I mentioned earlier. And again, I think this is what makes our lessons difficult. The starting point of any lesson is what is the objective of the lesson. And I think that this has to be clear right from the beginning. Sometimes I've observed lessons where, to me, I leave a class and I'm not sure what the objective was. And this is sometimes the case where we use materials or we use tasks and we engage students, but what is the reason? I mean, what are they supposed to be learning? And I think we have to be clear of what the objective is from our perspective. What is the place of the objectives in our curriculum? I think in most of your cases, the objectives are very clearly laid out. Is that the case? In your curriculum, they're quite clear what you have to cover. And I think they have to be measurable. How do we measure if students are successful? And we have to have measurable outcomes that are clearly stated, maybe as can-do statements. At the end of this lesson, students will be able to use the present tense in writing a sentence. So quite clear objectives. If they're not so clear, then I think this is where we can run into problems of trying to transmit from what the teacher is trying to teach or convey to the students. We have to be able to measure objectives. I mean, how do we measure them? Do we use tests? Are we using presentations? Are we using portfolios? This morning we spoke a little bit about portfolios. How do you measure whether the objectives are achieved? I think with older learners, I think it's important for them to know what the outcomes are. I think if students don't know what they're supposed to be learning, they can sometimes lose their motivation. And with older learners, I know with young adults, I always try to make it quite clear that at the beginning of the class, I usually write the objectives in very brief form on the board. So they know, today we're going to do this, this, and this. When I leave, I will have done this, this, and this. So I think with older learners, probably even at the senior high school level, it is important for learners to know, what did I learn today? Maybe it's some new vocabulary. Maybe it's a new grammar point. But I think that's what keeps them motivated, that they can measure what it is that they've learned on any given class or any given day. I think motivation is really important, and we heard that this morning again. How do we keep students motivated? And I think one way is to make sure they know what the objective is of a lesson or of a unit or a chapter, whatever it is that we're doing. I'll just share another picture with you. Comment? They're not so motivated to clear the snow at this point. Okay? But then, maybe this is a bit more Canadian, where parents spend a lot of time driving their children everywhere because it's a big place, so students, their children are involved in playing hockey or playing baseball. Parents have to do all the driving. So in this case, they're not very motivated until they realize, wow, if I don't do this, then it will affect me negatively. And now all of a sudden they're quite motivated to clear the snow. It's not an easy job clearing the snow off the driveway. It takes a lot of energy and time. So I think it's a little bit like objectives. They know the objective. If I clean the snow off, I will benefit from this. So I think that's a little bit of why I think a little bit about classroom teaching. So if I know what it is that I'm going to do, then I will be motivated. Delivery, I think delivery is probably the most difficult part of what we do because so many factors influence the delivery of our lesson. It's a very complex process, delivering a lesson, and I think this is where teachers have to think about so many things. We have to think about, what do our students need? What is their level? How do I keep them motivated so they don't sleep? That's an important question. Sometimes they do fall asleep in the back, you know. How do I keep them active? What technique do I use? There's lots of ways to teach. Should I use group work? Shall I have students, sharing their presentation? There's so many questions we have to ask. How will the lesson move? What will I do first? What kind of warm-up will I use? How will I teach this grammar point? Lots of questions every day we have to ask every lesson we do. Pacing, timing, these are really important. If it's too fast, we lose students. If it's too slow, we lose them. Groupings. Somebody talked about, don't put two enemies together. That was a suggestion this morning about when you group students, be careful not to put enemies together. Very important, grouping is so critical. Your whole lesson can fall apart if your groupings are not well organized. How do we check if students understand? Do they understand? Are they confused? Lesson aids. Shall I use technology for my lesson? Shall I use an iPad? Somebody asked me, do you use an iPad in the classroom? So many questions. Or shall I just use the chalkboard? Maybe that's enough. And teacher talk. I put this in here because this is sometimes what students tell me. The teacher talks all the time. Okay, we have a problem there. And so we have to monitor what we do and how much of the class time is taken up by us and how much is taken up by students. So this is a lot to think about when we do a lesson. Just many things, and I think that as teachers we do a very special job. I don't think everybody in their jobs have to think about this many things every day, and we deliver many lessons in one day, not one. And we're doing this 5-6 times a day, so it's quite a process. So if we look at this, now sometimes the first graphic, sometimes this works. It's great. But sometimes it doesn't. And again, we have to know to read our students, when do I use the first technique? When do I use the second technique? And one day, maybe the first one's great. Students are very involved, and then the next time you use it, no one's paying attention. So it's difficult to know what is the best way to deliver something. And I'm sure all of you have experienced that. Have you tried something and it works great? And then you try it again and it doesn't work? Have you had that experience? Lots of people know. I mean, it's happened to me a lot. And I always think, is it me? Is it the students? It's a good question to ask. Why? Why does it work sometimes and the next time it doesn't work? But I like this because I think sometimes it's quite easy just to switch things around and get happy students in the second situation, and really involved in what they're doing, and they seem much more interested in the lesson in the second graphic than in the first one. The other thing we have to think about are our materials. Now, this is one of my favorite things, because I love looking at materials and looking at how we can use them in the classroom. Again, with materials, there's so many questions we ask. How are the materials connected to my objectives? Are they suitable? Are they available? I don't want to spend 4 hours looking on the internet for a good lesson or a good activity. We do that sometimes. We spend hours trying to find the perfect lesson on present perfect. You know, it's a lot of time. And how practical. If you have a large class, maybe some materials are not going to work for you. If you're have young learners or older learners, there's lots of questions we have to think about. Are they well designed? Some materials aren't. And some, you have to decide how to choose materials that are useful or relevant to your students. The most important question is teacher prep time. Okay, how much time will it take me to make this? It can take a lot of time, and I think there's a ratio or a value. How much time does it take, and what is the value of this? I think you always have to weigh, is it worth for me to spend 2 hours to make this handout, and how much use will I get? We always have to think about those kinds of questions. Again, they should be, we think about, of course we want our materials to be interesting, we want variety, we don't want to use the same kind of exercise all the time. We want our students to be active, and not just busy. I saw a really good graphic, which I don't have here, where a student is expecting the teacher to entertain them. I don't think our role is to entertain students, but sometimes I think they expect us to entertain them. Keep them busy, make them laugh, do whatever. But I think that some lessons I've observed, teachers do seem to be entertaining the students, but I think they've lost sight of what the goal was in that situation. So I always tell my students, my job is not to entertain you. You have to do a little bit of work here, not just me. Critical thinking, of course, we want them to be independent in their thinking. We don't want to provide them with everything. Handouts, how many handouts do we need? I think sometimes some teachers use too many handouts, and it forces students to become so focused on the handout. And I think a lot of times we don't need so much paper, but we're used to it. We're used to handing out lots of paper. And of course, optimal use. This is something very important to me. If I make a handout or if I make something, I want to use it. And use it until it gets a lot of use out of it. Otherwise, my time was maybe not so well spent. And I think have you ever felt like that in your class sometimes? Yeah. And I think in this situation, maybe what the teacher is using is not so interesting for the students. If we just change the materials, or if we change the way that the students were arranged, I'm not sure, but how do we keep students like this a little more engaged in our lessons? I think if we lose students, then have you heard the expression to tune out? Have you heard this idiomatic expression, tuned out? Do you know what it means? Share. Do you know what it is? Tuned out. Idiomatic expression that when you tune out, you don't pay attention. And you're not paying attention, you're tuned out. And so you've lost your students. When sometimes we say that the students are tuned out, that they're not paying any attention to what you're doing. And I've heard that term used in teaching. I think in the next slide it shows here. So it looks like this young guy here is tuned out. He's not really paying attention to what the teacher is doing. And there could be many reasons here. We don't know what the reason is. Is the lesson, is it too slow? Is it too fast? Is it too difficult? It's not active. Is the teacher talking too much? The student thinks it's boring. It's not interesting. Or maybe thinks, I don't need this. This is not relevant to me. And I think this is where you get the tuned out learner, somebody who's just not paying attention. And that's why our task is difficult, because sometimes in these situations of students who are in like this. And just a few statistics, I found this kind of interesting study about, when students are they're bored and they're not interested, they're not paying attention. And we're looking at, it's a pretty high percent. 50% of students in U.S. high schools are bored, meaning they're not paying attention if they're bored, I would think. And it's interesting what they said that causes them to not pay attention. And the very first one is interesting. 75% said, what is the first one? Materials. Yeah, materials are not interesting. And I think that's kind of this was only 17% of these students, but that's a high number. 75%, the materials are not interesting. I thought that was, compared to the other points here, that's quite high. That they rated the materials as not interesting. And of course, relevance, it's not challenging, too easy. And no interaction with the teacher. I'm thinking maybe this is more of a lecture-style classroom where the activities are not, where the teacher's not involved, or the work is too difficult. And so in all these situations, when we plan, we're thinking about all of these things. So it makes our jobs difficult, very difficult. So I think we look at what is effective instruction. I'm not sure if you would take a few seconds to read that. A few phrases stand out here. Mentally active participant. I think that's a phrase that we can think about. Meaningful and important challenges. It's another key phrase there. Intellectual rigor, so nothing that's too easy. And connected to the world outside the classroom. And I think somebody this morning said, when students or parents said, why do we need to learn English? That's a good question. If there's no connection or no feeling of why do I need this, it can affect how the student is in the class. So I thought this is kind of a nice, I like the language used in this quote here about what is effective instruction. Okay, so we're going to look at a few now practical, so I think, again, back to the title of the presentation, I think these three areas are key. And I think they're very connected. So when we plan lessons, if something is missing, we're going to get confused students, possibly like the first slide. Sometimes if the objectives are not clear or the delivery is not clear, I think we can get confused students. Or we can get tuned out students. If the delivery or the materials are not engaging, we're going to get the student who tunes out and doesn't pay attention. And so all of these are something, they're connected, and we have to think about them connected whenever we plan a lesson. I'm going to look at a few practical ideas now. And I'm going to show 3 activities and a couple of online activities. And I think what all of these activities